Agravain growled to us at the back of the hall. Gorfithid also demanded the restoration of his cousin, Gundlius of Siluria. Tudric, who had suffered more than any from Siluria's raids, was reluctant to put Gundlius back on his throne, and we Dumnonians were unwilling to forgive him for Norwenna's murder, while I hated the man for what he had done to Nimue. But Arthur had persuaded us that Gundlius's freedom was a small enough price to pay for peace, and so the treacherous Gundlius was duly restored. Gorfithid may have seemed reluctant to conclude the treaty, yet he must have been persuaded of its advantages, for he was willing to pay the greatest price of all for its successful conclusion. He was willing for his daughter, Cynwyn, the Star of Powys, to marry Arthur. Gorfithid was a dour man, suspicious and harsh, yet he loved his 17-year-old daughter, and he poured onto her all the remnants of affection and kindness that were left in his soul. And the fact that he was willing for her to marry Arthur, who was no king and did not even possess the title of prince, was evidence of Gorfithid's conviction that his warriors had to be turned away from fighting fellow Britons. The betrothal was also evidence that Gorfithid, like his son Kynaglas, recognized that Arthur was the real power in Dumnonia, and so, at the great feast that followed the council, Cynwyn and Arthur were formally betrothed. The betrothal ceremony was deemed sufficiently important for the whole assembly to decamp from Caer Sws to the more auspicious feasting hall on the summit of Caer Dulvorwyn, that was named after Dulvorwyn, a meadow at the hill's base which, appropriately enough, meant the Maiden's Meadow. We arrived at sunset, when the hilltop was smoky from the great fires, on which deer and swine were being roasted. Far beneath us, the silvery Severn twisted in its valley, while to the north the great hill ranges stretched dim towards darkening Gwynedd. It was said that on a clear day Cader Idris could be seen from Caer Dulvorwyn's peak, but that evening the horizon was misted by a distant rain. The lower slopes of the hill were thick with great oaks, out of which a pair of red kites climbed as the sun turned the western clouds scarlet, and we all agreed that the sight of the two birds flying so late in the dying day was a wonderful omen for what was about to happen. Inside the hall the bards were singing the tale of Havren, the human maid who had given Dulvorwyn its name, and who had turned into a goddess when her stepmother tried to drown her in the river at the foot of the hill. They sang until the sun dropped. The betrothal was performed at night, so that the moon goddess would bless the pair. Arthur prepared for it first, leaving the hall for a whole hour before returning in all his glory. Even hardened warriors gasped as he re-entered the hall, for he came in his full armour. The scale coat, with its gold and silver plates, glittered in the flamelight, and the goose feathers on his high, silver-chased death's head helmet brushed the hall rafters as he strode up the central passage. His silver-covered shield dazzled in the light, while his white cloak swept the ground behind. Men did not carry weapons in a feasting hall, but that night Arthur chose to wear Excalibur, and he stalked to the high table like a conqueror, making peace, and even Gorfithid of Powys gaped as his erstwhile enemies strode towards the dais. Till now, Arthur had been a peacemaker, but that night he wanted to remind his future father-in-law of his power. Cynwyn entered the hall a few moments later. Ever since our arrival at Caer Sws, she had been hidden in the women's quarters, and that concealment had only heightened the expectations among those of us who had never seen Gorfithid's daughter. I confess that most of us expected to be disappointed in this Star of Powys, but in truth she outshone any star. She came into the hall with her attendant ladies, and the sight of the princess took men's breath away. It took mine. She had the fair colouring more common in Saxons, But in Kynwyn, that fairness was turned into a pale, delicate loveliness. She looked very young, with a shy face and a demure manner. She was dressed in a robe of linen dyed yellow gold with hive gum, and the dress was embroidered with white stars about its neck and hem. Her hair was gold, and so light that it seemed to shine as brightly as Arthur's armour. She was so slender that Agravain, who was sitting next to me on the feasting floor, commented that she would be no good for breeding children. "Any decent baby will die trying to struggle through those hips," he said sourly. Yet even so, I pitied Eileen, who must surely have hoped that Arthur's wife would prove to be nothing more than a dynastic convenience. The moon sailed high above Caer Dorvorwin's summit as Kynwyn paced slowly and shyly towards Arthur. In her hand she carried a halter, the gift she brought to her future husband as a symbol that she was passing from her father's authority to his. Arthur fumbled and almost dropped the halter when Kynwyn gave it to him, and that was surely a bad omen. But everyone, even Gorfythid, laughed the moment away, and then Iorwith, Powys's druid, formally betrothed the couple. The torches flickered as their hands were bound in a knotted chain of grass. Arthur's face was hidden behind the silver-grey helmet, but Kynwyn, sweet Kynwyn, looked so full of joy. The druid gave his blessing, enjoining Gwydion, the god of light, and Ranrod, the golden goddess of the dawn, to be their special deities, and to bless all Britain with their peace. A harpist played. Men applauded, and Kynwyn, lovely silver Kynwyn, wept and laughed for the joy in her soul. I lost my heart to Kynwyn that night. Many men did. She looked so happy, and no wonder, for in Arthur she was escaping the nightmare of all princesses, which is to marry for their country rather than their heart. A princess will be bedded with any stinking, slack-bellied old goat if it will secure a frontier or make an alliance. But Kynwyn had found Arthur, and in his youth and kindness she doubtless saw an escape from her fears. Leodegan, the exiled king of Henisweiren, arrived at the feasting hall at the climax of the ceremony. The exiled king had not been with us since our arrival, but had instead gone to his own home north of Caer Sws. Now, eager to share in the largesse that always followed a betrothal ceremony, he stood at the back of the hall and joined in the applause that greeted the distribution of Arthur's gold and silver. Arthur had also gained the permission of Dumnonia's council to bring back Gorfythid's war gear that he had captured the previous year, but that treasure had been returned privately, so that no man present need be reminded of the Powisian defeat. Once the gifts were given, Arthur took off his helmet and sat beside Kynwyn. He talked to her, bending close as he always did, so that she doubtless felt she was the most important person in all his firmament, as indeed she had a right to feel. Many of us in the hall were jealous of a love that looked so perfect, and even Gorfythid, who must have been bitter at losing his daughter to a man who had beaten and maimed him in battle, seemed happy in Kynwyn's joy. But it was on that happy night, when peace had come at last, that Arthur broke Britain. None of us knew it then. The distribution of the betrothal gifts was followed by drinking and singing. We watched jugglers, we listened to Gorfythid's royal bard, and we roared our own songs. One of our men forgot Arthur's warning and fell into a fight with a Powisian warrior, and the two drunken men were dragged outside and drenched with water, and half an hour later they were clasped in each other's arms, swearing undying friendship. And sometime in that period, when the fires roared high and the drink flowed fast, I saw Arthur staring fixedly towards the back of the hall, and, being curious, I turned to see what had trapped his gaze. I turned and saw a young woman, who stood head and shoulders above the crowd, and who carried a bold, defiant look on her face. "If you can master me," that look seemed to say, "then you can master whatever else this wicked world might bring." I can see her now, standing amidst her deerhounds, that had the same thin, lean bodies, and the same long nose, and the same huntress eyes as their mistress. Green eyes she had, with a kind of cruelty deep inside them. It was not a soft face, any more than her body was soft. She was a woman of strong lines and high bones, and that made for a good face and a handsome one, but hard, so hard. What made her beautiful was her hair and her carriage, for she stood as straight as a spear, and her hair fell around her shoulders like a cascade of tumbling red tangles. That red hair softened her looks, while her laughter snared men like salmon caught in basket traps. There have been many more beautiful women, and thousands who were better, but since the world was weaned, I doubt there have been many so unforgettable as Guinevere, eldest daughter of Leodegan, the exiled king of Henisweiren. And it would have been better, Merlin always said, had she been drowned at birth. The royal party hunted deer next day. Guinevere's hounds brought down a pricket, a young male without antlers, though to hear Arthur praise the dogs you would have thought they had chased down the wild stag of Difford itself. The bards sing of love, and men and women yearn for it, but none knows what love is, until, like a spear thrown from the dark, it strikes. Arthur could not take his eyes from Guinevere, though the gods know he tried. In the days after the betrothal feast, when we were back at Caer Sws, he walked and talked with Ceinwen, but he could not wait to see Guinevere, and she, knowing just what game she played, tantalized him. Her betrothed Valerian was at the court, and she would walk with her arm in Valerian's arm, laughing, then cast a sudden, modest, sidelong glance at Arthur, for whom the world would suddenly stop in its turning. He burned for Guinevere. Would it have made a difference if Bedwin had been there? I think not. Not even Merlin could have stopped what happened. A man might as well call on the rain to go back to the clouds, or command a river to curl back to its source. On the second night after the feast, Guinevere came to Arthur's hall in the dark, and I, who was standing guard, heard the ring of their laughter and the murmur of their talk. All night they talked, and maybe they did more than talk, I wouldn't know, but talk they did. And that I do know, for I was posted outside the room and could hardly help but listen. Sometimes the talk was too low to hear, but at other times I heard Arthur explaining and cajoling, pleading and urging. They must have spoken of love, but that I did not hear. Instead, I heard Arthur talk of Britain, and of the dream that had brought him over the sea from Armorica. He spoke of the Saxons, and how they were a plague that must be cured if the land was ever to be happy. He spoke of war, and of the terrible joy it was to ride an armoured horse into battle. He spoke as he had spoken to me on the ice-cold ramparts of Caer-Cadern, describing a land at peace, in which the common folk did not fear the coming of spearmen in the dawn. He talked passionately, urgently, and Guinevere listened so willingly and assured him his dream was inspired. Arthur spun a future from his dream, and Guinevere was deep inside the thread. Poor Ceinwen. She had only her beauty and her youth, while Guinevere saw the loneliness in Arthur's soul and promised to heal it.